When an explosive detonates, the pressure wave has a very high value, but only for a very short amount of time. Peak value of the pressure is less than a thousandth of a second. When a high explosive detonates, the pressure at its surface can be 2 million pounds per square inch, but that's only for a very short amount of time, and then the pressure drops off precipitously. All materials are viscoelastic, even steel. They have to stretch in order to have a load. This is known as stress following strain. In order to have a load, a stress, in a piece of steel or other material, it has to physically elongate. While it is elongating, it does not have the full load. The materials themselves are a bit like taffy or rubber. They don't stretch immediately. There is a time involved in getting them to stretch. A ship's hull can be protected against explosions, which would be mines and torpedoes, by hollow aluminum balls. The hollow aluminum balls can be held in place with some material like caulking. The caulking can be made out of silicon, vinyl, pick whichever other material you like. So the entire protective layer would look like a giant piece of nougat, but instead of having nuts and fruit, it would have hollow aluminum balls. There would be an inner structural hull, which is what the aluminum balls would protect, and then there would be an outer hydrodynamic hull to maintain a streamlined shape for the hull. In between those two would be the blocks of nougat, which would be in place during construction, and then additional caulking would be extruded around the block to firmly lock it into place. When the aluminum balls are collapsing, they can only transmit the amount of force it takes to collapse them, and it is only after they've been fairly compressed that they can transmit a higher level of force. But that time that it takes to compress them delays the shock wave. A series of balls will collapse in sequence, each one taking a small amount of time. And so the peak pressure of the shock wave will never reach the inner hull. Balls can be arranged in different manners. One option would be a random arrangement. It might be better to sequence them. One possibility is to have the inner balls having thicker walls than the outer balls. So the outer balls will crush under a lower stress, while the inner balls will remain intact until the pressure level rises. Another possibility is to have balls of different sizes. The smaller balls closer to the inner hull, the larger balls further away. The inner balls will be stiffer, and again, they will collapse in sequence. The outer balls will collapse, and until their pressure rises, the inner balls will not start to collapse. And that will again delay the pressure wave and protect the inner hull. The connections between the inner hull and the outer hull have to be flexible. If they're rigid, an explosion outside the outer hull could drive the rigid connection through the inner hull, puncturing the inner hull. So they have to be flexible so that any explosive force will deform them and not enable high pressures and high forces to be transferred into the inner hull. The block of nougat and caulking will provide some force between the inner and outer hull to prevent the outer hull from bending and flexing. For submarines, there is the additional problem that the weight of the nougat plus the outer hull has to equal 64 pounds per cubic foot, the weight of seawater. A ship on the surface, if you add weight to it, will sink a little bit deeper into the water. It has reserve buoyancy. A submarine is neutrally buoyant. If you add extra weight, it goes right to the bottom. So the nougat and outer hull have to be neutrally buoyant so they do not adversely affect the stability and buoyancy of the submarine. If a box is drawn around a sphere, the sphere will contain about half the volume of the box. If you shift the balls around so that they overlap and indent into each other, spheres can take up about 60% of a volume. Aluminum weighs about 150 pounds per cubic foot. Dense plastics and rubber weigh about 100 pounds per cubic foot. Obviously, there's lighter plastics that weigh less than 60 pounds per cubic foot because they float. So there's a fair amount of range in the weight of materials that you could use for the caulking the bulk of the nougat. If a material is chosen that weighs 60 pounds per cubic foot, the balls represent 60% of the volume, then the matrix material is 40%. 40% of 60 is 24. If you subtract that from 64 pounds per cubic foot for the weight of salt water, you get 40 pounds. And that would be 27% of the 150 pounds for the weight of aluminum, which would mean that the balls would have to be 73% empty. If you multiply 0.9 times 0.9 times 0.9, that's 0.9 times 0.9 is 0.81 times 0.9 is about 0.73. It's a three-dimensional object, so that represents the scaling in the 3 dimensions. That would mean that if a ball was 20 millimeters in diameter, 10 millimeters in radius, the wall thickness would be 1 millimeter thick. And the question is then whether that is strong enough and stiff enough to slow down the explosive shock wave. One possible solution, if necessary, is to put high-density balls that can absorb the explosion close to and alongside of the inner hull, and then further out have lighter balls with thinner walls that are not very good at absorbing explosion, but which provide a lower density. And so the whole average density of the dense balls and the less dense balls would again be 64 pounds per cubic foot. The other problem with this is that you're physically making the hull larger. The hydrodynamic surface, the wetted surface, is expanded. That's going to mean more drag. It may also mean more noise. A potential advantage of this, if you can make it work, is that the torpedoes can be mounted outside into sponsons in the outer hull. That way, if a torpedo should explode, the balls will protect it against the detonation of the submarine's own torpedoes. The torpedo would be mounted into some kind of indentation sponson, and then there would be an outer hatch. In the remaining space around the torpedo, something would have to be placed. You don't want an air bubble that's going to explode when you open the hatch. So perhaps something like a petroleum jelly would be packed in. And then the hatch would open up, swinging out the torpedo, and the motion of the water would wash the petroleum jelly off the torpedo, and the torpedo could go on its way. For this design, the forward hydroplanes on the submarine would have to be mounted up on the sail to give the torpedoes a free field of fire when they are released. Two potential problems of mounting torpedoes on the external hull are, number one, just the reliability of the system, and the other is the amount of hydrodynamic noise when the hatches are open to release the torpedoes. This can also be used to release cruise missiles. The cruise missile would be in a double-walled cylinder with an end cap to protect against the pressure. The hatch in this case would have to be hinged so that the hatch opens downwards so the cruise missile can float upwards away from the submarine. When using this, there has to be care taken to ensure that the cruise missile and its assembly doesn't drift backwards into the propeller. It also has to be in back of the sail area with the hydroplanes on the sail. The cruise missile and its cylinder would drift up to the surface, the end cap would be blown off, and then the cruise missile would be launched. One of the advantages of this is that the cruise missile could sit on the surface for half an hour, 1 hour, 2 hours, while the submarine moves to another location. So when the cruise missile is launched, even if someone sees the launch, it doesn't indicate the position of the submarine. The pressure isn't that bad. At 1,200 feet under the ocean, the pressure is about 80,000 pounds per square foot. So if the tube is 2 feet wide, each outer wall is resisting the pressure of 1 square foot, or 80,000 pounds. If you divide that by 12 inches, that's 7,000 pounds per inch. Steels are readily available that have over 100,000 pounds per square inch yield point, which would mean the tube of the cylinder could be as little as 1/10 of an inch thick, although you have to be careful against buckling and you have to perhaps add stiffeners to prevent buckling. This would allow the submarine to release cruise missiles from depths of 1,000 feet. After the cruise missile is launched, the tube would just sink to the bottom. This does allow submarines to launch cruise missiles without having come close to the surface. In theory, this can also be used for submarine-launched ballistic missiles, but there's a serious problem with scouting. They're huge. They're 7 feet in diameter, they're 45 feet long. Build them and the cylinder for carrying them, it would be very difficult to mount them on the outside of a submarine. The other problem is that they're so big, because of their size and the limited number of places to put them on the outside of the submarine would not be able to carry that many missiles. This entire design of protecting ships with aluminum balls could have been done in World War II, so 80 years ago. This design of using rows of aluminum balls to protect a ship against an external explosion will work. The question is, how many rows of balls do you need and how thick would the material have to be?